Hi, this is your Sapna Bhartiya, and we are here at Open Source Summit in Seattle. And today we have with us once again Joe Winchester, Senior Technical Staff Member of Open Mainframe Project. Zowe, Joe, it's great to have you on the show again.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure to host you here today. Of course, we are going to talk about Zowe project. But before we talk about the details, the popularity, the growth of it, let's quickly talk about what is Zowe. What role is it playing in the larger mainframe ecosystem?
The Zowe project, it's about 5.5 years old now. And at the inception of the project, it was really about bringing open source methodologies and technology and ethos to the mainframe platform, which tends to be viewed as being quite sort of proprietary and locked and just controlled by a few key vendors. So at the very initial design summit for Zowe, there were three founding principles: open, simple, and familiar. So to make the platform and tooling more open around open source. So the Open Mainframe Project is a steward of that, which is a Linux Foundation umbrella project. Simple, so that the generation of folks growing up now with IT are used to more distributed technologies around, things like Visual Studio Code and command lines and more sort of modern languages, perhaps, that have grown, the things that they learn at college when they get hired by a customer. So make it simple for them and make it familiar for them. And that's really the North Star behind the Zowe project.
What is the bridge that Open Mainframe is trying to build between new developers and this, very stable, very mature technology?
That's such a fantastic question. And I could see as you were asking that question, you were almost having the same struggle in your mind. It's a very bittersweet thing. It's a gift and a curse that the mainframe is such an old platform. It's actually 60 years old this year. April the 7th was the anniversary of the S360. One of the things that IBM is very proud of on the mainframe platform, so IBM is my employer, is the fact that you can have written something 60 years ago and it still works today, right? So it has this incredible depth of backwards compatibility, which is a gift and a curse, because for any project to be successful, you have to embrace the new kids on the block, the people who are experienced in other IT architectures, swimming in and out of mainframe. But you also have to make sure you don't leave behind your sort of incumbent, skills-based and workforce and tools. And that's a balancing act, and we walk that every day with Zowe. Yeah.
Can you talk about the role that mainframe is playing in today's modern world? We talk a lot about cloud-native technologies. We talk about Kubernetes, but every time we do any transaction, a lot of critical, it goes through one or two mainframe. I just want to make sure that people do understand.
It's a really good question. Yeah, I was actually at a little mini summit last night, having some pizza, enjoying some time with some of these wonderful open source folks here, and somebody came up to me and looked at my badge and said, "Oh, does IBM still exist anymore? I thought you used to make PCs. My grandpa has one in their garage," literally. And that person wasn't trolling me. So you're absolutely right to do the level set. So when most people think of the word mainframe, they generally think of the IBM Z16 platform. It's a very thoroughly modern computing architecture, and it's the backbone of transactional IT in the world. So in terms of finance, mainframe's customers are the banks. I love walking around Seattle because every time I look at, I go, "Oh, that's bank XYZ," or "That's somebody else." They're one of Zowe's customers. So every time you use a payment transaction or do, especially insurance, systems of record, government agencies, they basically bet their business on the mainframe being a very secure computing platform. But it works in concert with everything else you talked about, so Kubernetes. So in fact, you can run a lot of distributed non-mainframe architectures and tech on the platform as well. So it has that blend of old and new.
The reason I asked the question was also so that the modern developers, when they look at jobs, when they look, what are the opportunities that are there, so that they should look at, hey, mainframe is also a space, and then mainframe is not also that old school Unix like that we used to have in the early green screen and everything else. There are a lot of things which are modernized. So where a lot of developers, what is exciting about mainframe? Because a lot of us, we do things not just because there is nothing else to do, but there's something which we feel passionate about.
You're absolutely right. And I was having this discussion just actually at a mainframe conference with a university professor. Phenomenal man. I'll call him out by his name, Dr. Cameron Say. He works, I think, at East Carolina University, ECU. And he said his mission is to basically create something exciting for his students. He evangelizes the mainframe, but he says, I only evangelize it because it gives my students a career path, a solid career path with a great employer and lots of fun opportunities in their life to not only put a roof over their head and their families, but also be rewarded and technically challenged and engaged. AI is very important to the platform. So if you're a bank and you're doing lots of IT transactions on behalf of customers who are traveling all over the world, they're buying coffee in one country, they go to another airport, they might buy something else, they might walk through duty free, see something valuable they want to buy for somebody. You've got to make sure that all of those transactions coming in are genuinely for that customer. So fraud detection, Mainframe is very, very good at doing fraud location with AI models co-located. It has what's called a talent processor. That's a phenomenal use case it has. The uptime, it achieves 8 nines uptime, which is 99.7. Anyway, I can't do the math. I think it's a stupid amount of uptime, just a few seconds or fractions of a second a year, which is unplanned outages. So you can, and that's very, very important in the kind of global IT. I mean, even when the sun is over the Pacific and everybody in the world, apart from the Hawaiians, are asleep, there's still a lot of IT that has to occur. So you can't afford for things to be down. It's very challenging as well because I talk to students who, when they come in and they look at some of the incumbents who are perhaps older towards the end of their careers, and they're picking up some of what they've learned. You're being led by some of the kind of, the Yodas or the who are, the Harrison Fords, some of these people who are top of their game. And you're right, maybe they are using a green screen, but what they're doing is really intense transactional computing at scale. So, the messaging requirements to keep everything up, to make sure that a cent never gets slipped. You're counting people's money, people's pensions, system of records, driver's licenses and things like that. Those are very hard technical challenges. It's a very exciting career.
What kind of career scope is there? Because I was also talking to Clyde yesterday from LF, training. Because a lot of industries, they feel that there is a huge gap in supply and demand of technical folks. So when it comes to mainframe industry, what kind of skill gap is there? So the reason I'm saying is when people look at mainframe or Zowe, they're like, hey, there's a career opportunity as well.
There is a skills gap. I won't hide from that. There is a skills gap. You're absolutely right. Especially when Windows came along I was a Windows developer for years. Very exciting computing architecture within perhaps the 90s and the noughties and things like that. Definitely, people didn't go towards mainframe as careers, and a lot of customers were migrating workload away from the mainframe. I won't deny that. And some of that's been very, very successful. What we're seeing right now is to address the mainframe skills challenge. The Open Mainframe Project has a lot of learning initiatives. It recently partnered with a Interskill. They offer a badge which you can get, authentication and creditly. It's the most issued mainframe badge ever. So a lot of people are flocking towards Zowe as being the kind of gateway badge to get them in to sites. IBM just launched something recently. I know it's Open Mainframe Project. I'd talk to IBM because IBM partners with the community called the Mainframe Academy. The Open Mainframe Project recently, I say recently, but during the pandemic, there's a good news story here, which is there was a big demand for COBOL programmers because a lot of systems, especially in the US government, were very stressed because a lot of people needed their government to support them through being, furloughed, and a lot of those transactional-based systems all of a sudden had a lot more work. People were at home and they couldn't handle that. So the Open Mainframe Project launched a COBOL education course that really powered, and thousands of people retrained or reskilled or new skilled to become COBOL developers to basically support all of that extra workload that was needed by certain government states. And as a result of that, all of those training courses are still left behind, and they're training more students up. A lot of partnering is done with universities. So definitely there is a skills challenge. It's being addressed. Personally, I'd like to see more done, but that's why I come to these conferences, to talk to you and hopefully get the message out there that there's a lot of good stuff.
Why would a modern developer look at mainframe?
One of the reasons that we wanted to do the Zowe project was that when you look at the mainframe through the lens of Zowe, it looks like nothing that you wouldn't expect it to. You can use it through Visual Studio Code. It looks like a file system. You can access containers on it. You can access the Linux environment. Ironically, I have a little side story. which is I remember working with somebody and he was in their 20s, and he came to me about a week after he'd been working on the Zowe project, and he said, I'm really annoyed because I haven't been working with the mainframe. And I said, well, what do you mean? And he said, oh, I see all the movies and everybody hacks the mainframe and it's all a bunch of green screen. And all I saw was a bunch of really modern tooling where I'm just dragging and dropping everything around. When do I get to see the mainframe? I'm like, dude, you've been working on it, right? So, and I saw you chuckle because it's a kind of a good news story there. So, but the reason that you would do computing on the mainframe is because it's very, very secure. It's very, very reliable. It's very, very fast. And the mainframe's customers, I'm going to get the number wrong, so apologies, but it's certainly in the 70s to 80% of all of the world's financial data, your bank balance, everything to do with credit cards is held on the mainframe computing platform. Right? It's a very, very large number. It's used by a huge number of Fortune 5 companies. I don't have all the data, so I won't try and get it wrong by quoting it wrong, but it's all out there. So you can have a very, very good career instantly working with these very, very large enterprise customers who have money to spend, who are doing some very exciting things with IT. They want to get to new markets. They want to get to mobile payments. They want to get to micropayments. They want to get more, branch into new geographies. They also have lots of challenges through GDPR, DORA, data breach. We've seen open source. Supply chain has been an attack vector recently. XZ is very high profile. That just occurred, a few weeks ago. So again, all of these customers are embracing open source and new tech, but they want to make sure they don't let their customers down. It's a very exciting field. It's intellectually challenging.
Now let's go back to Zowe. Can you give us an update about the adoption of the project? What kind of growth you're seeing there?
So as I mentioned, the Zowe project is about, let's say it's 5 years old, but when Zowe version 1 was first released, so one of the dichotomies that open source has is it needs to be kind of like, free and, all open, and it has that kind of like, festival sort of hippie feel to it, but you have to have the backing of an enterprise customer. Zowe long-term support was first released in, I think, March 2020. So every year we try to track the adoption. So within the first year, from March to December 2020, which is during the start of the pandemic, Zowe adoption, we believe, was about 10% of all mainframe customers. There's a survey that's done by the Arcati yearbook to poll customers. Then it went to 20%. Then it went to 38%. I'm going to round it up to 40 just to see the double-digit growth. And then that was 2021, 2022, 2023. And we just got the yearbook for looking back on 2023. And of the mainframe customers they polled, 85% of them are using Zowe. And if you follow the crossing the chasm, that's phenomenal for a product where we've only been tracking 2020, 2021, 2022, 5 years, yeah. So we only have 4 years worth of data, effectively looking back. So that's double-digit growth. So definitely, I've been around mainframe computing for a huge amount of my career. I have a 26-year career at IBM, not all in mainframe computing. But so I know most of the mainframe customers, certainly in my geography, which is Europe and the US, where I'm traveling this week. There's not a single one of them that isn't using Zowe technology in one way, shape, or form. The success has exceeded my expectations and everybody else who started the project.
What is the driver behind this adoption and growth?
What's the driver behind adoption? Wow, that's a good question. It's a bit of a curveball. I wasn't expecting you to ask that one, so I'm going to have to do it. One of which I think is the education, and you touched on it with skills. So one of the most important things, so I grew up remembering when a lot of grassroots technology, like Windows 3.1 and things like that, became pervasive, or when and that's really because it was used by educational establishments. Microsoft did a very, very good job with MSDN program and getting it into schools and colleges. And then as those people grew up and got hired, they then went into large organizations that perhaps weren't using Microsoft technology, and perhaps some of the big enterprise vendors like IBM probably even didn't feel that threatened by Microsoft. But then they tipped it over because they said, this is really easy to use and we can scale it up. And the same is true with Zowe, because the Zowe adoption has been through the training courses. So a lot of training courses pivoted towards using Zowe rather than teaching mainframe on green screens. So all of a sudden we saw a generation of people being hired. And I was at a bank just a few months ago, and I went in there, and as I walked around the bank, can't tell you who they are for privacy reasons, half of the monitors I could see in the bank had Zowe running on it. And then I went into a meeting and I asked the same question as you. I was like, how did you end up adopting it? And they said, well, we hired some students from a university. They came in They showed us some cool stuff they were doing. They taught us how to do hackathons. They taught us how to, innovate, get pizza in, get everybody jamming in a room, solving some cool projects collaboratively. They brought in all of those principles and learning practices. And then that pivoted the bank to start adopting Zowe technology. So I think it's really grassroots up. Also, IBM and Broadcom and Rocket Software offer enterprise support for Zowe. So it backs it with 24/7. A lot of great companies, Kyndryl, are very much pushing Zowe out to their customers. So you see grassroots and you see enterprise, and customers like that.
Can you also talk about what kind of projects are there in Zowe, either incubated?
That's a really good question. The incubation project. So Zowe has, every few years, it releases, I think every 18 months. So version 1, version 2. We're right now looking towards version 3. We don't have an exact release date. There's a few engineering and other issues have to be sorted out there. But so we have some core projects in Zowe, but we have some incubators, and they're really fun because they can be started by somebody who comes along to the Zowe community and says, I've got some interesting idea, and then we normally kind of weed and feed them. And some really exciting ones going on. A really interesting project is, so one of our first IDE, integrated development environments, that we targeted was Visual Studio Code, very, very popular. Open source IDE, open source by Microsoft, but everywhere you walk around here, you'll see people using VS Code. It's taught by universities. Within the Java community, there's a platform called IntelliJ, and a group in Poland called the IBA group, they donated to the Zowe community a plugin for IntelliJ, and that's becoming really, really popular. I see a lot of adoption by that, and that's a really, really thriving incubator project that's going on at the moment. There's one called Zen, ZEN, which is a very kind of a sort of Buddha relaxed technology. And I love the word because it's also a play on words with the Z or Z coming from Zowe. And that's because a lot of customers were struggling to install Zowe on a ZOS environment. It's difficult. Mainframes are hard to use. And the people who haven't grown up with it found it difficult and were struggling. So some really smart folks got together and said, let's solve this with some really cool, let's bring the beauty of a kind of Windows installer, something where you just literally click and hit next and ask a few questions and it does all the heavy lifting behind you. And it has some cute little graphics and emojis and makes it more fun. So that's come along. That's an incubator project. That's really, really nice to see that growing, to see that kind of fresh talent coming in, and they're bringing a new instrument and a new kind of beat into the band, and they're basically revitalizing that. Those are the two that really stand out for me at the moment, yeah.
You were talking about version 3.
Yes.
Of course, as you said, it's still in the pipeline, but what kind of things people can expect,
That's a really good question. So right now, Zowe version 2 is the most successful platform that we have just because of the when we began it, and it's coming to the end of its sort of lifetime now. I think we've just released version 2.16. So the 16 would be our 16th release times 6 weeks. I can't do the math anyway, but it's been on the menu for a while now. And after a while, you always have to stabilize a release because some of the technology in it decays. You have technical debt in there that you need to get rid of. And within an active release of a software product, you can't change it too much, right? You just can't change the menu around too much. You annoy your customers and you annoy the people who are extending it. You have to stabilize. So Zowe version 3, within those two projects I mentioned, the installer and the IntelliJ plugin will become part of Zowe Core, which just gives us more kind of more notes to basically play with on the musical instrument. A lot of open source projects now are really being challenged by things like DORA and security scanning. A lot of Zowe mainframe customers, they're banks, they're very, very concerned about security. There's been a lot of high-profile attacks, everything from SolarWinds to XE, which is very, very fresh in people's minds. So we're really going and looking at the entire inventory of software to make sure that when version 3 is released, absolutely everything in there, we have a lot of confidence that we can basically support that and maintain that going forwards. So there's also a lot of really cool nuggets coming in within Visual Studio Code. We're trying to embrace, people have asked us for more use cases and more scenarios and more enterprise deployment. So we're putting in things there that basically mean that rather than it being a hobbyist experience, if you think back to your PC where you use it locally, once you connect it, you want to have more collaboration tools to be able to work with other people. So that's a vector that we're kind of pushing towards version 3 as well.
Earlier you were talking about you're walking through a bank and you saw a lot of terminals that are running Zowe there. Can you talk about what are the other use cases that you've seen of Zowe? And second part of the question will be, what are the use cases where you think Zowe will be ideal?
So the use case, one of the DevOps. So DevOps, which is basically shift left. So the earlier a developer developing a piece of code or maintaining a fix or something can test that, provision a system up, deploy that, and get confidence it's going to work, and have everything that they need to give to the deployment teams before that rolls into production, the faster you can do that in a more agile way, the better the world becomes. It just becomes a much healthier world. And a lot of mainframe customers were challenged with DevOps a while back, but they were very risk averse about, because if you deploy something into production and all of a sudden people go to their ATM machine or they try and buy their coffee and it gets declined, it literally takes seconds before it hits social media and your stock price starts to slide. So people are very risk averse around that. So giving people confidence to do DevOps, embracing modern DevOps practices, that's a very, very popular use case towards Zowe. Having the development experience, I talked a little bit about COBOL earlier. So there's a huge amount of COBOL. I think it's still the world's most popular computing language. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's been overtaken by JavaScript or some C# or something. But there's so much incumbent technology on there. Before Zowe came along, the main way that you develop that was through a green screen interface. Now people develop it within Visual Studio Code, and we've got IntelliJ coming in the rearview mirror. And that's a big one as well. People want to open up these applications and start to service them and start to make them more secure and build in more use cases. So all of those are coming. Those are probably the two most popular ones for me. And there's a lot more with AI coming down the road. AI really, really excites me. People having LLMs, large language models, to basically collect a lot of data and then use that so that somebody who's coming into an area that isn't a subject matter expert can basically benefit from all the knowledge left behind by those behind them. So training people to understand how an application has been put together, or language awareness. Those are really exciting things coming down the pipeline.
It may be too early, but from Mainframe's perspective, where is Gen AI in your radar? Is it too early? It's not the right use case? And we cannot look at both aspects, mainframes for Gen AI and Gen AI for mainframes.
It's a really good question. So the mainframe is quite a specialist computing platform. So it's a transactional processor. But one of the success stories that I was really shocked when I heard this was, we came back to fraud detection. So every time a transaction goes through, you hit your credit card. I think every time you blip your credit card to buy a cup of coffee or something, I think it travels through about 7 mainframes. So all of your payment providers, all of your banks will be running mainframe. So it goes through lots of other bits of architecture, but there's about 7 mainframes generally is the average, I think. They get involved in that transaction through different people. And they all have to make sure that when they got some traffic coming in, it was trusted, that the person has the right money, we trust it, and then they pass it on to somebody else. Fraud detection has to occur. If you reject too many payments, your customer's just going to go somewhere else. They're going to go buy their coffee next door, or eventually they're going to leave you as being your bank or your payment provider. So you have to give them quality of service. And then eventually, if it was a fraudulent transaction, you undertake the risk. You go, well, we authorized it, we're sorry. So the banks take a hit, okay, because they have to underwrite this fraud. And there's a lot of fraud. There's scammers out there and all sorts of bad people, bad actors in the world. So one of the things, the IBM Z16 Talon processor on the mainframe, what people have done there is they've created the AI models and they've trained them on what is a fraudulent transaction and what isn't. And then they deploy those models co-located. So right next to it's the exact same piece of silicon that's doing the transactional computing is also doing the AI. And customers have told stories where they've gone from being able to do fraud detection on 15% of all transactions, right, to 100%. So there are banks right now using mainframes and using AI-based models they're trained externally, right? The mainframe computing platform isn't where you want to build your LLM, but once you deploy it there and you co-locate it on the silicon, so we're talking about literally nanometers and laws of physics about how quickly you can do this with no network latency, and co-located on the processor, they're able to give you 100% of accuracy and confidence that that person buying that coffee, they're your customer, and that's the coffee shop that they lined up with this morning. So for me, and I'm drinking my coffee. I must have coffee on the mind, yeah. But so absolutely, I wouldn't use a mainframe. There are other platforms out there. There are quantum computing that's very, very exciting, vector. that really excites me, and there's a lot of interesting things. Yeah, but
Joe, thank you so much for taking
Not
time
at all.
today
It's a
and
pleasure.
talk about, of course, Zoe and the whole mainframe space. Thank you so much for those great insights, and I'd love to chat with you again. Thank you.
Likewise, and thanks so much for letting me bring the story to everybody else and all the wonderful work you do in the community. It's an absolute pleasure to sit next to you. Thank you so much.